The Sumerian cities of antiquity were razed, leaving behind remnants of suffering, devastation, and the wretchedness of conquest. Before I die, please listen. These 6 words uttered by Samuel Noah Kramer, the world's most eminent Assyriologist, transformed everything we believed we knew about ancient history. Kramer was not a myth seeker or a popular theorist. He was a scholar who spent his life deciphering the Sumerian clay tablets, the first civilization in the world. But toward the end of his days, he alluded to something too explosive to release, that the Sumerians were not only documenting history, they were coding it. What he found inside those tablets was not language. It was a framework for molding and directing reality itself. The more he delved, the more it was apparent. Our contemporary world continues to function on the millennium-old blueprint. For half a century, Kramer rendered thousands of Sumerian documents, hymns, royal proclamations, temple records, and tax rolls. To other historians, they were the mundane records of a civilization mastering the art of writing. But Kramer saw peculiar patterns. Certain phrases recurred time and again, even in unrelated documents. A hymn to a goddess could have a line in common with a ledger in a warehouse. A builder's diary could be the same as a ritual chant. One phrase particularly disturbed him: to raise the pure mountain and bind heaven and earth. It was found in temple hymns and in building chronicles. Why would something so heavenly be found in a builder's diary? It wasn't chance. Kramer saw these recurring phrases were intentional. Holy mantras intentionally interwoven throughout all types of writing. For the Sumerians, religion and administration were never separate. All taxes, all offerings, all documents were acts of worship in association with cosmic order. In weaving divine language into mundane functions, they turned governance itself into an act of worship. Writing, he concluded, wasn't a neutral invention. It was an operating system. As soon as he realized that, he couldn't help but see civilization, ancient or modern, differently anymore. The second epiphany wasn't inscribed on clay, however, but on stone. Standing before the ziggurat of Ur, Kramer realized at last what the tablets were gesturing toward. The ziggurat was not only a temple. It was a 3-dimensional book. Each level, each step, each alignment reflected patterns of language seen in Sumerian writing. Constructed using divine numbers, 3, 7, 12, and 60, the building was both myth and mathematics. To ascend, it was to walk upward through stages of meaning, the earthly, the heavenly, and the sacred. Even the builders' language echoed their hymns: to purify, to bind, to ascend. The ziggurat was theology materialized into stone, a living sentence that converted faith into form and form back into faith. Kramer realized that the Sumerians had synthesized religion, politics, and architecture into one self-sustaining system. To dwell in a Sumerian city meant to live in language itself. The walls were speaking, the terraces sang, and all ritual was a grand cosmic grammar. Then Kramer started to imagine something sinister. The scribes, not priests or kings, were the real architects behind the system, and Kramer was convinced they knew what they were doing. His last epiphany was chilling. The scribes were the secret engineers of civilization. Their control of cuneiform provided them with control of thought. In Sumer, to inscribe something was to give it existence. When a scribe insisted that a king was ordained by the gods, it did not merely define power, it constituted it. The word in writing possessed divine sanction, blurring the distinction between truth and decree, myth and law. With writing, the scribes created shared belief without violence or troops. Kramer named it the Sumerian Code, a self-replicating formula encoded in language, architecture, and ritual. The ziggurats, the temples, even the list of grains were governed by the same logic. The system did not require weapons to command minds. It required only symbols that people chose to follow. To rule the mind, Kramer wrote, one must rule the symbols. That was the Sumerians' big secret. The first algorithm of belief, the first software of civilization. And if Kramer was correct, then that code never died. It transformed itself into our institutions, our bureaucracies, our laws. We are continuing to use their language, to think their thoughts. As soon as humanity mastered the art of encoding reality in words, the only issue left was, who is holding the stylus? When Kramer shifted from writing to building, he discovered an even greater truth. The Sumerians had constructed their cosmology into the very fabric of their cities. The ziggurat wasn't a single temple, but one node in an enormous grid of sacred geometry. Streets lay in lines with celestial courses. Courtyards duplicated constellations, and all measurement duplicated mythic proportion. Their buildings were not utilitarian. They were linguistic. Every brick, every line, every angle was a syllable in a huge physical sentence of divine order. A ziggurat didn't simply look toward the heavens. It addressed them. When priests ascended its terraces, they weren't so much performing rituals as reading the city itself, interpreting a message inscribed in earth and sky. Kramer likened these buildings to stone computers, machines that calculated human devotion through geometry and repetition. The structures weren't symbols of faith. They were faith itself. With every restoration or rebuilding, the ancient program was recompiled. And then, at last, Kramer came to understand that Sumerian writing and architecture were not two systems, but two implementations of a single system, one written on clay, the other constructed of stone. To destroy a city was to erase text. To rebuild it was to rewrite belief. The Sumerians had learned that space could be used as language, and that belief could be constructed by structure. But still, the question persisted, who invented the system, and who sustains it even today? Kramer's findings drove him to a disturbing conclusion. The real creators of Sumerian civilization were not priests or kings, but the scribes, people who never held power but always put pen to paper. As he waded deeper into the ancient records, he came to realize that Sumer's ultimate power was not divine but literate. Scribes were the unseen rulers of the real, dictating each decree, transaction, and prayer before it was ever impressed into clay. They did not just write down words. They determined which words counted. They seemed to be at the service of temple and throne, but actually they served both and something greater. Kramer called them the neural network of civilization, bringing every thought, order, and belief into solid form. Their schooling was intense. In schools of tablets, young clerks copied math, grammar, hymns, omens, and proverbs, learning to combine practicality with spirituality until the two were indistinguishable. A word might signify both God and star, a symbol both grain and blessing. This double meaning wasn't error. It was intentional design, enabling scribes to conceal theology within taxation and worship within accounting. For Kramer, each scribe was statistician and priest all at once, converting power into perdurance. Dynasties fell, kings rose and fell, floods swept through and departed, but the scribal code remained. It persisted across empires, continuing in new owners under new masters. That's when Kramer started to suspect something extraordinary. The Sumerian scribes had constructed the first self-replicating system of ideas. It required no armies or prophets, just clay, repetition, and compliance. By writing, they had developed a civilization that was self-sustaining, and the key to its survival, Kramer figured out, wasn't in the words but in the digits. Sumerian math intrigued him because it refused to stay functional. It was symbolic, refined, and sacred. Some numbers, 3, 7, 12, 60, kept popping up in myths, rituals, measures, architecture. To modern minds, they were numbers of measurement. To the Sumerians, they were sacred laws of harmony. Temple sacrifices, commercial exchanges, and ziggurat proportions all conformed to these heavenly patterns. Every calculation expressed cosmic order. 3 for gods and triad, 7 for completeness, 12 for the heavens, 60 for perfection, the foundation of their whole system. What amazed Kramer was how the same numbers governed religion and bureaucracy as well. Crews were paid in 60 cycles, offerings made in 7s, temples constructed by 12s. This wasn't math. It was ritual masquerading as math. He had termed it ritual mathematics, where counting served as prayer, measuring as obedience. The Sumerians weren't just measuring reality. They were keeping it in sync. Their 60-minute hour and their 12-month year still influence us today. Kramer understood that this mathematical order was not merely a device of efficiency. It was the scaffolding of belief. It encoded obedience as structure, taking mundane routine to be devotion. As he followed the connect between words, numbers, and architecture, he called it the Sumerian Code. It was not a concealed message to decode, but a cultural operating system, an algorithm of civilization. The tablet, the temple, the ritual, each a piece of a program that repeated itself from generation to generation. Language imposed structure. Structure replicated divinity. Divinity legitimated hierarchy. The system self-corrected. When one element failed, another recreated it. For Kramer, this was the initial type of automated belief, a feedback loop in which text supported structure and structure supported text. His colleagues at the Institute rejected the notion as metaphor, but Kramer was adamant that the code did not define order, it created it. He observed the system continuing through millennia, from Sumer to Babylon, from Assyria to later empires. It changed but never went away, forming the basis of all ideology since religion, statecraft, even culture itself. What frightened him the most was that the Sumerians had constructed the first artificial order, one not run by electricity, but language. And when he was on the threshold of death, he could not help but ask if human beings ever managed to get out of it, or if we remain inside their program, carrying out its instructions word by word, law by law, symbol by symbol. By the time Kramer retired, however, he no longer viewed writing as a chronicle of civilization, but as its driving force. The clay tablets were not archives, but loops of influence on human thought, and the world constructed from it. Each wedge pressed into the clay was an act of engineering, not of machines, but of meaning. He termed this process reality inscription, that writing not only describes reality, but inscribes it. He informed his students that the biggest lie of literacy was the supposed neutrality of literacy. The modern historians regarded cuneiform as crude, a rudimentary step toward more sophisticated alphabets. But to Kramer, it was no means of communication. It was a means of control. Once inscribed on clay, an idea became law, faith, or memory, irrevocable and unimpeachable. The Sumerians,